Hello and welcome back to AP Psychology. I'm Miss Lee and we are still in Unit 7. This video is going to be focusing on stress and coping. By the end of this video, you should be able to discuss theories of stress and the effects of stress on psychological and physical well-being. This will specifically target the general adaptation theory, stress-related illnesses, Lewin's motivational conflict theory, and unhealthy behaviors. We will also be discussing contributions of Hans Selye, who is a key researcher in the psychological field of motivation and emotion. If you haven't done so already, go ahead and grab your notes and let's get started. Just a couple of pieces of information about stress. If you don't already know, these are important kind of foundational pieces to understand. Psychological states can and do cause physical illness. Stress is any circumstance that may be real or perceived and threatens one's well-being. And when stress is severe, it can impair our ability to cope with it. So let's discuss the difference between a stressor and stress. The stressor is a stressful stimulus. It's a condition-demanding adaptation. It's the thing in this scenario. The stress is the physical and mental changes that have to occur in response to the challenge or threatening situation. So it is the person's reaction to the thing. So the stressor is the event or the stressful situation, and stress is the resulting reaction, and stress is the resulting reaction. There are four components to the stress response. First, there has to be some type of a cognitive appraisal. The person experiencing the stressor identifies the threat and determines how that person will cope. And this is going to be different for everyone. There is a physiological response. It's the body's reaction. This is not something you have any choice over. It's mostly autonomic. It's mostly automatic. You have subjective feelings about that. So this is emotional reactions to the situation. Again, these are very different for every person. And then last, you have the behavior, the action taken because of the stress. So this is the person's choice of coping mechanisms. Stress isn't just a stimulus or a response, though. It is the process through which we appraise and cope with the environmental threats and challenges. And so there are kind of two paths that a person typically takes because of a stressful event. So let's say, for example, you have a really tough math test coming up. There are two ways of looking at this or appraising this situation, which are going to lead you down two very different paths. The first one is that this situation is threatening. So you might say, oh my gosh, this is way beyond me. I can't do this. There's no way that this is going to be successful for me. I'm going to fail. And so the result could be that you're stressed to distraction. You are overstressed, you are over aroused. This is a more problematic pathway to take for the same stressful event where people might say, you know, this is a challenge. It's going to be tough. I've got to get to work. This is something that I can accomplish. It's going to take some effort. And so that person is more likely to be aroused in a more advantageous level. And so they are better able to focus on the event at hand, the stressor at hand. When short-lived or taken as a challenge, stressors can have positive effects. However, prolonged or threatening stress can in fact be harmful. It's really all how we appraise it and how long it lasts. We discussed this theory very briefly in our last video, but I want to just reiterate Lewin's motivational conflict theory. He was a social psychologist and he studied conflict. And very much like in the cognitive realm of psychology, the theory of motivation and stress is looking at two things that are incompatible. And it's very much like cognitive dissonance in social psychology. These internal conflicts can manifest in stress. But it really does, again, depend on your cognitive appraisal, what you make of it, how you frame it in your mind. So the example of the math test, it's either a chance to prove what you know or it's a chance to fail. It's how you look at it that makes the difference and sets the level of arousal for that stressor, whether it's good arousal and focused arousal or distressful arousal and too much stress. We discussed the approach and avoidance choices, but one additional key that I want to make sure that you understand is that as you move closer to the choices, whether it's an approach choice or an avoidance choice, the choices increase in their power as you move closer to those choices. So think about something that you don't want to do. That would be more of an avoidance gradient. you are actually going to get more stressed as the event becomes closer to you. So if you're waiting your turn to give a speech and you're really, really super nervous about it, you think you're going to fail, your heightened arousal is going to increase substantially as you get closer to that event. Same thing if it's an approach choice. If you are really super looking forward to a movie that you've been waiting to come out and you're on your way, you're going to have that increase in arousal as you get closer to the movie theater, as you get in line for your popcorn, as you go find your seat. All of those things, you're getting closer to the choice event, and the heightened sense of arousal is going to get much, much higher as you get closer. So just as a review, we've got 3 different types of motivational conflict according to this theory. There's approach conflict, where there are 2 relatively equally attractive goals. So this is like basically going to Hawaii with your best friend or going to Hawaii with like your favorite family member. They're both really great choices, and they're both win-win. I mean, you can't lose by either of these choices. These typically are more minimally stressful, and they don't typically stay a conflict for very long, so they're unstable. They're easy to resolve. Approach avoidance conflicts, there's one goal with both attractive and repellent aspects. So an example could be taking a year off before college. There are good and bad aspects of that. It is not something that's typically going to just go away. It can be difficult and it's moderately stressful because there are 2 sides that are going to pull and push at the same time. And so the last one is avoidance, and you've got 2 equally repellent goals. There's no attractive aspects, there's no good in either of it. This can be highly stressful, it's very difficult to resolve, and it's stable. It's not just going to kind of resolve itself. It is one of the more difficult types of conflicts. All right, so let's look at the different types of stressors that we typically encounter. You've got catastrophic events, life changes and strains, chronic stressors, and just daily hassles. Catastrophic events can be sudden, they're unexpected, they're potentially life-threatening, and they're typically experienced as a trauma. Then you've got life changes and strains. These are circumstances that create demands that people have to adjust to. And keep in mind, this can be both positive and negative. It can be going to your favorite college. It can be getting married. It can be going to prom. It can be, really anything that is life-changing or straining on you. It's a circumstance that even if it's seen as very positive, it's going to create demands. So what are some other examples of these types of stressors, both catastrophic and these life changes or strains? Then you have chronic stressor. These are stressors that continue over long periods of time. And then daily hassles. These are irritations or pressures and annoyances that by themselves don't really add up to a lot, but when they are compounded on one on top of another, they can be very stressful. So what could be some examples of each of these types of stressors? So let's look at the stress response system. Cannon proposed that stress response was fast and a fight or flight response marked by an outpour of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the inner adrenal glands. And this influx of hormones increases our heart and respiration rates, which mobilizes sugar and fat, and it also dulls pain. So these physiological changes set us up to be able to be resilient to stressors. You may want to pause the video here so you can kind of take a look at the illustration of these physiological responses. So adding into that, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland also respond to stress, but this is a more slow adaptation response, and it triggers the outer adrenal glands to secrete glucocorticoids, which is cortisol. And this is just the beginning of the stress. And this is just the beginning if the stress is longer lasting. The longer you have cortisol in your system, the higher your arousal rate is going to be kind of on an ongoing basis. And that can lead to some problems. All right, so let's talk about the general adaptation syndrome. According to Hans Selye, stress response to any kind of stimulation is similar. So it doesn't matter if you're being attacked by a bear or you've got the AP psychology test coming up. The stressed individual is going to go through 3 different phases. And you see those phases illustrated to the right on your screen. So stage 1 is the alarm reaction. The hypothalamus is setting off the fight or flight response. And this is going to release neurotransmitters and hormones into your body to deal with the stressful situation. If the stressor persists over long periods of time, this initially adaptive reaction can become distress, and it depletes the body's energy and defense resources. So basically, in the long term, this can cause high blood pressure, deterioration of the immune system, fatty deposits in blood vessels, ulcers, all sorts of physiological problems. Stage 2 is resistance. If the stressor persists but is not so strong that it overwhelms the organism during stage 1, the individual begins to rebound during stage 2. They kind of get accustomed to it, and outwardly, the body appears to be gaining an advantage. It's resisting the stressor. Inwardly, however, the body is trying to restore homeostasis. This is a word that you should be familiar with from several videos back. The body is still, however, working to cope with the stress. So even though it appears on the outside that the body is doing really well, it is still fighting this long-term battle. Resistance only applies to the original stressor. So keep in mind, if other stressors are introduced, the defenses could be so depleted that it could be unable to respond to the second stressor. So you've got one huge stressor, and then something else hits, and then something else hits. And so the resistance is only going to apply to that original stressor. It doesn't apply to additional stressors. Stage 3 is exhaustion. If resistance fails to relieve stress, the symptoms of alarm can reappear. This time it's accompanied by even more powerful autonomic nervous system response. The ANS overcompensates, and the body has already used up so much energy that if the stressor is not removed, exhaustion and basically eventually death will occur. There are usually some warning signs of exhaustion. We're talking heart attacks, clogged arteries, excessive colds, flus, frequent headaches. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had strep throat 3 times in one season. So looking back on that, I was certainly in stage 3 of exhaustion. My system was completely overwhelmed and the exhaustion was taking over. Any stressor, including mental processes like worry, can affect one's health and resources like the immune system. The immune response, which evolved to deal with short-term stressors, may react to chronic stressors by breaking down and turning on itself. How? There's no physical enemy to battle. So the bodily responses become maladaptive and the body becomes more and more vulnerable to infection and injury. Stress can have a variety of health-related consequences. Stress makes healthy choices harder and unhealthy choices like drinking caffeine and smoking and getting less sleep and eating fast food more common and frequent. Persistent release of stress hormones then cause long-term effects that we already kind of discussed a couple of slides back. We're talking heart disease, immune suppression, autonomic nervous system effects like hypertension and headaches. All right, so let's briefly talk about some personality types and how they respond to stress. We've got type A and type B. You've probably heard of these. This is relatively mainstream at this point. Type A is a term used for very competitive, hard-driving, impatient, verbally aggressive, and anger-prone people that become stressed out quickly in most cases. Type B people are more easygoing, relaxed people that seem to deal with stress more easily and don't tend to get too anxious or worked up. So what I want you to do is think about a prototype, like a TV character or a movie character, for each of these two types. What do they look like? How do they act? How do they respond to stress? So let's talk very briefly about ways that we can alleviate or handle stress. Basically, reducing stress by changing events that cause stress or by changing how we react to stress is called problem-focused coping. So for example, your car keeps breaking down, causing you to stress, so you address the problem and buy a new car. Well, that's great if you can. If you have the resources, that's an amazing and easy and highly effective way of alleviating your stress. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. Unfortunately, it's not always the case that we can just easily do that. When we can't change a stressful situation and respond by attending to our own emotional needs, it's called emotion-focused coping. So, for example, you break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, which causes you stress. So you seek support from family and friends. You look for a support system. This is more of an emotion-focused coping because the event isn't necessarily going to be changed, but how you deal with it can be changed. And that is it for stress and coping. In our next video, we will start a kind of mini series on the theories of personality. I can't wait to see you then. Bye for now.